All right, we're back for the second half of this section. And as promised, we're going to talk about the death penalty in the United States. The United States is kind of a strange case in the world of the death penalty. If you noticed on one of the previous slides from the first half of the section, the vast majority of the countries that imposed the death penalty in 2020 were not major, rich, industrialized nations. They were kind of third world, global south kind of nations. So the United States is one of the very few kind of Western, industrialized, democratic nations that still chooses to oppose the death penalty. But as I've stated in previous sections, you can't take one country as one culture and one political ideology and one society. So we're going to delve a little bit deeper into the United States and the death penalty and how it's not necessarily as simplistic as the United States still murders people. So first, a little bit of history. The United States has had the death penalty kind of since the beginning. 1776 broke off from Great Britain. We had the death penalty then. We still have the death penalty today in certain circumstances. Now, in the late 19th century, or the mid-19th century, the first jurisdiction to ban the death penalty, maybe in the world, or at least in the kind of Western major industrialized world, was the U.S. state of Michigan. They were the first, if not one of the first, if not the first, region in the world to formally outlaw the death penalty. And a few other states outlawed the death penalty prior to 1972, but most of the country had and utilized the death penalty. But then in 1972, there was a Supreme Court case called Furman v. Georgia, in which the Supreme Court of the United States said that the death penalty, as then currently imposed, violated our constitutional amendment right against cruel and unusual punishment. So it wasn't necessarily, they made it very clear in their ruling that it wasn't necessarily the death penalty as an idea, it was only the death penalty as then imposed that meant that it was cruel and unusual. So states started kind of modifying their death penalty laws, changing around who can get executed and how and why and in what situations and all these things. And then they tried again. So in 1976, just 4 short years later, there was another Supreme Court case where the Supreme Court said, because you've made these changes, because you've modified the way in which this is implemented, you're good to go again. And so that reinstated the death penalty from 1976 onward. And there were a bunch of different changes that they made. For instance, prior to 1972, you could get the death penalty for a whole host of different crimes. Post-1976, the only kind of ordinary crime you can get the death penalty for is murder. And not just murder, but what has come to be called capital murder. And capital murder is different than just murder. Capital murder has to have one or more aggravating factors. And each state that still has the death penalty has a different list of aggravating factors. So the state of Georgia has a different list of aggravating factors that will turn a murder into a capital murder than the state of Texas, which has a different set of aggravating factors that will turn a murder into a capital murder than the state of Oklahoma. Each state does it differently, but each state, according to Supreme Court precedent, has to have one of these lists of aggravating factors that must be present in addition to a murder to turn it into a capital murder. Some of the common ones around the states that still retain the death penalty are things like killing somebody under the age of 10 or 12 or 18, murdering a police officer or firefighter during the commission of their duties, murdering multiple people either at the same time or at different times, so either mass murder or multiple murder. Murder during the commission of another felony. So like if you burglarize somebody's home or during an armed robbery or something like that, you murder someone that's an aggravating factor that can get you the death penalty. But once again, each state has a slightly different list. Those are just some of the more common things you see on that list. But just the fact that someone has committed a murder does not necessarily mean they're eligible for the death penalty. One or more of those aggravating factors has to be present. And as you can see from this graph, since 1976, since the death penalty was reinstated, we started off very slowly, but then number of executions peaked in the very late 90s, I think right around 1998, and has been steadily on the decline ever since. Now, this is very similar to the graph the map I showed you just a few slides ago in the first half of the section with where the law stands worldwide, but this is just within the United States. So 27 states, so more than half of all states, have legally banned the death penalty. And you can see those in green above. 18 states have no death penalty kind of in practice, right? In other words, they're still legally able to give somebody the death penalty, but it's been more than 10 years since the last one. So essentially they're on a moratorium at the minimum, by either formally or informally. And then finally there's 12 states in red in the picture above that still continue to use the death penalty and have actually implemented the death penalty within the last 10 years. And there's kind of a geographic pattern, if you'll notice. The states of the South, especially the traditional South of the mid-19th century, around the time of the Civil War, still use the death penalty fairly commonly, whereas the states of the Northeast, the Rust Belt of the mid-Northwest, the mid-North, kind of, Wisconsin, Michigan, Minnesota, those kind of states, and then the West Coast are much less likely to use the death penalty. And interestingly, this map, kind of the red and yellow states, are almost a perfect match to kind of normal presidential election states that go Republican. And then the green and blue states are almost a perfect match to the states that routinely vote for the Democratic presidential candidate. So there's a long link here between politics, history, slavery, the death penalty. All those things are very, very intertwined and can still be seen on maps like this. Again, it's not a perfect correlation, but it's pretty close. Now, as you remember from the first half of this section, in 2020, the United States used two different forms of execution. There was lethal injection and there was electrocution. But legally on the books, there are other methods of execution still theoretically possible in the United States today. Lethal injection is by far the most popular. Every state that has the death penalty either requires lethal injection or if there are other options, lethal injection is kind of the default. So with these other four, electrocution, gas chamber, firing squad, and hanging, those are only used at the request of the condemned. So, and only in certain states. So, if you remember from the last slide, there are only a few states that still allow the death penalty. Some of those only have lethal injection. Some of them have lethal injection as the default, but if the condemned chooses one of these other four methods, that request will be honored. So if you'll notice in 2020, there was the one electrocution. I don't know which state that was in, but wherever it was, that person chose to be electrocuted rather than receive lethal injection. But all four of those alternatives to lethal injection are still an option in at least one state that still has the death penalty in the United States. Lethal injection, just to give kind of a brief example of each. Lethal injection, somebody is strapped to a gurney, almost like a hospital bed. They're given an IV and then they're given a combination of 3 different chemicals, the first of which kind of knocks them out, sedates them so they're not conscious, and then the other 2 essentially stop their heart and kill them. Electrocution, as seen in this picture, you are strapped to a chair and then electricity is run through the body to the point where you expire. The gas chamber, imagine kind of an electrocution chair, but inside a large metal, almost spherical chamber. And then when a lever is pulled, some tablets or capsules fall into a pool of, I think it's water or acid or something, and release deadly gas, and that causes the person to expire. With a firing squad, somebody is stood against a post or a wall and blindfolded, and usually it's 5 people with rifles will aim and fire at their chest. One of the 5 has a blank cartridge, usually, in order to kind of give all of the 5 executioners kind of the belief or the possibility that maybe it wasn't me that killed him. And then with hanging, of course, you put a rope around the neck and a hood and then open the floor so they plummet, and this is supposed to snap the neck and make death instantaneous, but occasionally that doesn't work out, and the person has to asphyxiate hanging from a rope. Now, as I said a few slides ago, the death penalty is kind of inexorably or inextricably tied to race in the United States. It is not a coincidence that the states that continue to use the death penalty, by and large, are former slave-owning states. So in the country as a whole, African Americans make up about 12% of the population, but they make up about 43% of the executions. Now that's horribly, horribly, horribly out of balance. If all people are assumed to commit crime equally, then, and all crimes are, essentially punished equally, then we would expect if they're 12% of the population, they should be 12% of the executions. To give you another kind of idea of how wide the balance is, there were 12 executions, and I want to say this is since 2000, where the offender was white and the victim was black. But there have been 178 executions where the offender was black and the victim was white. So you are much, much, much more likely, in addition to these numbers, if you look up other numbers, you'll find that just the victim being white tends to dramatically increase the odds of receiving the death penalty, and the offender being black also vastly increases the odds of the convicted receiving the death penalty. And when both are either not there or there, you can tell there's a wide, wide, wide disparity between those numbers. Gender is also an issue with the victim especially. If the victim is female, you're roughly twice as likely to receive the death penalty in the United States than you would if the victim was a male. Now, one of the most difficult discussions when it comes to the death penalty is the process or the concept of wrongful conviction. No criminal justice system is perfect. We are going to mess up sometimes, whether that's letting a guilty person go or convicting an innocent person. And in cases of the death penalty, we found that wrongful conviction is much more common than most people seem to think. There have been 186 times where we have found that somebody sitting on death row was wrongfully convicted, i.e. they were factually innocent of the crime, they did not commit it, but they were on death row waiting to be executed for a crime they did not commit. Now, 186, that's only the ones we know about. And it's difficult because post-execution, once the person's already been executed, there's no reason to continue investigating. There's no reason, even if some evidence arises that person may have been innocent, there's no reason to kind of investigate it further, and thus there is no kind of formal count of how many people would have been found to be innocent post-execution if we had kind of continued to investigate those cases. It's a little difficult to tell not only how many people were convicted wrongly, but also how many people right now are sitting on death row wrongly and just haven't been kind of discovered yet. But one of the largest studies done on the subject, a criminologist, looked at all the history and looked at all these different cases and really dug deep into the subject. And his estimate was that 4% of all the people that have been executed in the United States were factually innocent of the crime. 4%, that's 1 out of every 25. So some states, notably Texas, executes routinely 25 or more people a year. And that means kind of statistically, they're executing roughly 1 innocent person per year. Now, public perception of the death penalty. This, again, is fairly decently tied to actual crime rates. As you can see, support for the death penalty peaked about the same time that crime peaked and has been going down since. But there has been a rapid decline in the public support for the death penalty since the mid-90s. And remember, this is the United States as a whole. And I'm willing to bet anything my viewers would like to bet, that there are substantial regional differences in this view. I would bet that the states that still have the death penalty, the approval rate is higher than the national average. And in states without the death penalty, the approval rate is lower than the national average. But overall, support for the death penalty is going down very consistently. And it will soon be, or assuming there's some wiggle room in these statistics, maybe already is more unpopular than it is popular. This is only one pollster. If you look at other pollsters, there are a few that have already done high-quality international or national polls that show that there's more opposition to the death penalty than there is support already. So overall, the death penalty is getting more and more rare. In the United States, it's getting more and more unpopular, and it's being used less and less, and fewer states still have it. I think just a couple years ago, there was another state that went from the allowable list to the abolitionist list. So it is changing. Maybe by the time you're watching this video, more states will have gotten rid of the death penalty. But it is a very controversial topic, especially here in the United States. But I thank you for watching. I'll see you for the next section.